you'd like to open up your Bibles to Romans chapter 1, and if you get opened up to Romans chapter 1, you may also turn over to Romans chapter 12, because tonight we're going to do a lesson where we do this, back and forth, back and forth. And I think that I have most of the back and forths on the board behind me, so that you'll be able to follow in that way, but still, this lesson is for you to hopefully see some things in the text there and turn back and forth in your own Bible. And so, before I get started tonight, I got to talk with Ben just a little bit, and Lisa was texting a little bit ago. I think most of you were here. There's a few of you who are not here this morning, and then I imagine there's folks online who would like the update as well. This morning, as soon as services were over, Lauren had a seizure in the bathroom back there, and we are just abundantly blessed to have people who know what they're doing all around us. And so that was really cool in a bad situation to see people do what they do. And they did it today, and so we're grateful for that. But Lauren went to the hospital, and a couple things are ruled out, so that's good to know. She had a CT scan, and there's no tumor on her brain, so that's good. They checked her blood sugar, and I think it was 140, and so it's not like a diabetic thing, I would assume. I'm not a doctor. I'm not standing up here diagnosing it for you, but it's not probably a sugar thing. And she is, at least at the start of services, whenever we got here, she's currently in an MRI right now, and so some stuff that's come up is this may have been something that's been going on for a while now, so maybe since October, and so they just need to figure out what's going on with the seizures and what to do to move forward with it. But she's doing all right. Where is Caleb? Caleb's doing all right. We're glad that there's people to take care of her. That's what we want. Okay. So let me tell you, this is my last Sunday night lesson of the year. Next Sunday night is going to be our last Sunday night of the year, and Mark is going to be coordinating a singing to sing out 2020. Yes! And to sing in 2021. Let's bring the new year in with songs of praise and start it off right. And so this is my last Sunday night lesson of the year, and this is really... I asked Becky when she said, "What are you going to be doing tonight?" I said, it's really kind of a housekeeping lesson. I learned something when I was studying about idols several months ago. And this is a lesson that I put together, and I put the PowerPoint together, and it just never seemed like the right time to do this lesson. And I thought, instead of taking the idol study into 2021, let's just take care of it and move on with this. And so we're going to read, first of all, Romans chapter 1 and verses 18 through 32. And then we'll go back and we'll say some things about this. But this is how, I want you to notice this about this. And I'm afraid that I'm going to forget to say this part also. But Romans is basically two parts. There's the first part, which is the theological message. This is what Paul is trying to say about what salvation through Jesus is and how it works and all of that. And so there's the first part of Romans, and then you get to chapter 12, and then there's the practical part of Romans. And the practical part is based upon the theological part that we talked about in chapters 1 through 11. This is what it means for your life, and 12 through the end of the book. And so hopefully I'll remember to draw your attention to that. But let's read verses 18 through 32. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So he starts off with this idea that all humanity, not just Jewish people who were raised up in Jewish God-fearing homes with the law and hearing the law and knowing what God would want from their lives, even Gentiles, all people have been exposed to God in His creation. And he says specifically in verse 19 that what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to us. Invisible attributes, eternal power, His divine nature. We should be able to look at creation and the world around us and say, this didn't just happen on its own. And so even though we may not know things like don't work on the Sabbath, we can still know things like there is an eternal creator God. And the idea that we're going to be talking about here, and that this lesson is coming from with idols, and especially this lesson that we become what we worship, is that this is the God that we're supposed to worship and to reflect. We're supposed to see Him and know Him and know who He is and know what He's like, and to reflect that in our lives in the way that we serve Him and behave because of Him. Okay, verse 21 through 23. For although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. And so he starts off with this idea that we've been talking about in our idolatry lessons, that they did not honor Him as God. And so this is what happens when you worship and serve other things, whether it's any of the things that we talked about in our study. We talked a lot about family. That's the one that I talk about first because that's the one that I feel the most. To put all of my emphasis and all of my focus on my family and my love for my family, or money or career or any other created thing. They didn't honor God, they honored these other things instead. And he describes that as them becoming futile in their thinking. Remember the idea of the golden calf? They worshipped a cow, so they became like a cow. Their thinking became futile, empty, worthless, pointless. Their hearts, their foolish hearts, were darkened. They thought that they were wise and that they knew an awful lot, but they were fools, ultimately, in the idea here of becoming what you worship. They exchanged the glory of God that we read about just a second ago, His invisible attributes and His eternal power. They took that glory and they exchanged it for created things. And specifically, the created things mentioned are birds and animals and creeping things. Not good is the point here. And so, starting in verse 24, God gave them up. Let's read 24 all the way down to the end of the chapter. Therefore God gave them up, and their lust of the hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. You will see here a couple of different times that they exchanged, they swapped out. And remember, within the context of our study with idolatry, and especially with our context of you become what you worship. You worship a cow, and they became like a cow. This is what they did. They exchanged over and over again. They took the truth about God that they can look at and they can see that the God created all things. They took that and they exchanged it for a lie instead. In verses 26 and 27, they exchanged the natural relations of men and women for men with men and women with women. And in verses 28 through 32, they knew what the right thing to do was, but they didn't do it. They chose not to do it, and they did the opposite anyway. And so it's this exchanging that takes place all throughout Romans chapter 1. There are 3 times in verses 24 through 32 where it says God gave him up. There's a book by Tim Keller called Counterfeit Gods. And Tim Keller said something that has stuck in my mind ever since I read it. One of the worst things God can do to someone is give them over to the desires of their heart. One of the worst things that can happen to us when we say, ooh, I like that, I want to pursue that, the worst thing that can happen is that we get it. And at least in terms of who we worship and who we serve and bow down to. And so that's Romans 1, 18 through 32. You can see a lot of idolatry in that text and how that text works. One thing that I didn't realize before I came to this study is that Romans starts with this and goes all the way through chapter 11 based upon not serving the one true Creator God of heaven and earth. That's the start of all trouble. And then we get to the practical section that begins in chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2. And what we're going to do in this lesson is we're going to say chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2 specifically refers back to chapters 1 verses 18 through 32. But before we do that, as we just read 12, 1 and 2 here, see if you can find it first. As we read through these 2 verses, see how many things you can see that are the opposite of what we just talked about. I appeal to you, therefore, that is based upon everything that we've said for 11 chapters. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I think there are 6 different things, and you may find more. I would be interested to know if you see more in there, but I think there are 6 different things in this lesson that I'm going to do just real quick to go back and forth and look at here. Number 1, when we go the road of idolatry, and when I say idolatry, I'm not talking about bowing down and worshiping a little statue, like the one that I had up here from India throughout some of my lessons. I'm talking about putting anything else before God. That's what I mean when I say idolatry. When you worship and serve and bow down to anything else before God in heaven. When you go that road, wrath and death is the end of that road. You can see it in Romans chapter 1 and verse 18. It's how it starts. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. And then the very last verse closes off this theme by saying that those who practice such things deserve to die. This is the end of that road. The wrath of God and ultimately spiritual death. The gospel, on the other hand, that Paul has established throughout the book of Romans, the gospel does not center on wrath and ultimately spiritual death, but rather God's mercy. He starts off this section by saying, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God. It is the opposite of the wrath and spiritual death that comes with idolatry. And so, if you just compare Romans 1 and Romans 12, you've got one that ends in wrath and death, one that ends in the mercy of God. The second thing that you can see in chapter 1 and verse 24, is the idea that God gave them up. We said this just a second ago, that God gave them up to the dishonoring specifically of their bodies. The dishonoring of their bodies is, there's a couple things in Romans 1. Let me grab my Bible here. I forgot my Bible over on this side. There's a couple different things about dishonoring your bodies. First of all, in verse 24, therefore God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because here's what dishonoring their bodies is. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Remember, we've already talked about these two passages. In Psalm 106 and verse 20, this refers to the golden calf incident. And it says that what the people of God did is that they exchanged their glory. That is, God created man in His likeness and in His image, and they were created with the intent of reflecting that likeness and image of God, and they exchanged that for a cow that eats grass to worship the golden calf in Exodus 32. In Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 11, my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. And so the idea of dishonoring your body, for God to give us up, the dishonoring of your body in verses 26 and 27, the exchanging of natural relations, men with women, instead men with men and women with women. And all of these things down here at the end of this section of Romans chapter 1, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness, it's to take what we were intended to be and to dishonor it in all things. And so you have God giving us up and dishonoring of our bodies. The alternative with the gospel and what Paul has called for throughout Romans, by the mercy of God, is to take this body that we have dishonored and to present it to God as a living sacrifice. Rather than dishonoring it by saying, I'm going to do all of these things that I shouldn't do, that we talked about up to this point. Instead, what I'm going to do is say, here is my body, God, that you have created, and I'm going to offer it to you, to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. That's number 2. Number 3, in Romans 1 and verse 25, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. And this is the word specifically that I want you to notice here. They worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. It's the word served that I'm pointing you to, because that word served is also used in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. And I would imagine, you won't know this probably if you just look down at your Bible, but of all of the different versions of Bibles that we have in the room here today, they all say something different at the end of Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. Some of your versions say something like, present your bodies a living sacrifice which is holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. That's what my ESV says, which is your spiritual worship. Some of your versions say something like, which is your rational service. What? And that idea there of service to God is the same thing. In idolatry, we're serving things that are not God. And in Christianity, what we do is we present our bodies as a living sacrifice to God, and that is our service to Him. Let's talk about this service for just a second. I should have put this up. I forgot that I had it. There's some different examples of what some of your different Bibles say about that. Here are 4 different things, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I'll really probably just look at 2 just to give you an idea of what some of the conversation is about here. Number 1, what is it? When I present my body as a living sacrifice to God, what is that? What does that mean to be spiritual worship? Number 1, spiritual in the sense of inner worship that involves the mind and the heart, as opposed to worship that simply goes through the motions. That's what we talked about this morning. present your body as a living sacrifice to God in the way that we talked about in the Sermon on the Mount this morning. It's not just checkbox theology where I say, I did this, I did this, I did this, I've done everything that I'm supposed to do. But rather, in a deep and spiritual way, you say, I am offering my whole self to you. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice, which is your spiritual worship. That could be one way of thinking about it. The New King James Version says, which is your rational service. I think that makes sense in this conversation because rational service is the idea of which uses your brain. And the contrast in Romans 1 would be, here are a group of people who have gone out into the world and have bowed down to and worshiped cows and fish and other things that are created, and that is not a rational thought process that somebody has thought all the way through and said, hey, this sounds like a good idea to me. I created it with my own hands, but I'm going to worship it as a God who created me. That's not it. Instead, offer your bodies as a sacrifice to God. That is your rational service. You think through it all the way to the end of the road, and it's something that makes sense. I'm not going to try and get into trying to define this word, but what I do want you to see, and the whole point of why I'm talking about it right now, is that in Romans 1, he says, idolatry ends by exchanging the truth about God for a lie and worshiping and serving something other than God. Romans 12 says, at least with Christ and with God's mercy, we're supposed to present our bodies to God in service to Him. That's really the point of all of this. Number 4, in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, there is a description of God's invisible attributes, His eternal power, His divine nature that have been perceived ever since the creation of the world. And in Romans chapter 12, the call is for us to not be conformed to this world, but rather to be transformed into these things, into the likeness and the image of God. And then I'll just keep on moving here. I'm sorry to go fast. I see that some of you are writing, so I'll burn just a few more seconds here by talking senselessly. But what is the idea of being transformed into these things? How do we do it? What's happening is we're transforming by the renewal of our mind. Look at Romans 1 and verses 21 and 22. The problem in Romans 1 was happening in their head. It was their thinking and their thoughts. They became futile in their thinking. Their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. Romans 1 and verse 24, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts. The hearts is the center of their being, the center of their thought process. And in the ancient world, that's how you describe that. In Romans 1 and verse 26, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. It's what's inside of me. It's what I want. And it's what I crave. It's what's in my head. And it's what's in my heart. In 1 and verse 28, God gave them up to a debased mind. And there is the specific use of the word mind. In Romans 12 and verse 2, we are not to be conformed to this world, which is this. Instead, we are to be transformed. How do we do that? By the renewal of our mind. The renewal of our mind, and we'll talk about what do we do to renew our mind. What does that mean in just a second? But I think it's at least worth stopping here for a second and saying, you're sitting around by yourself, idly. What passes through your mind matters. Your daydreams matter. If I'm sitting around and my daydream is to just think about all of the money that I would love to have someday, and my mind is just focused on that one thing that I crave more than anything else, Instead, what we do is we transform ourselves into the likeness and the image of God by renewing our mind to think about Him and His things and His purposes and His words, and focusing and concentrating on Him all of the time rather than things of this life. This is at least something worth reading, and I won't read anything else besides this tonight, but I thought this was helpful. This is from Douglas Moo again. Oh, look, I got it on the board there for you. The renewing of your mind is the means by which this transformation takes place. Christians are to adjust their way of thinking about everything in accordance with the newness of their life in the Spirit. This reprogramming of the mind does not take place overnight, but is a lifelong process by which our way of thinking is to resemble more and more the way God wants us to think. In Romans 1:28, Paul has pointed out that the people's rejection of God resulted in God's giving them over to a worthless mind, one that is unqualified in assessing the truth about God and the world He has made. I think about this all the time, and the idea of our debased mind. You ever look at the world that we live in today, and just some of the absolute silliness? Men who say, I'm a girl, and compete against other girls in sports when they're really men. And you say to yourself, how have we even, like, how is this even possible that we've arrived at a place where this is normal and acceptable? Here's the answer. God has given us over to a debased mind. The world has collectively lost their mind in a sense, in this way. And instead what we do is we renew our minds to think about God and to think about spiritual things and God's will for us. Okay, here's the next contrast. Romans 1 and verse 18. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who, by their unrighteousness, suppress the truth. I have so consumed myself with the world and become conformed with the world and thinking about the world and the ways of the world that all righteousness inside of me has been suppressed. That's the Romans 1 idolatry way of things. The Romans 12 Christianity way of things is, do not be conformed to this world. Be transformed. How? By the renewal of your mind. And this is what the renewing of our mind leads to. That by testing, you may discern what is the will of God. We are not, because of our unrighteousness, suppressing the truth and what is right and good and real. Instead, by the renewal of our mind, we're able to see the will of God and say, this is who God is and this is what God wants. Doesn't this sound an awful lot like the Exodus 32 thing? You worship a cow, I'm going to make you like a cow. You worship God in Exodus 33 and 34, and you get to be more like God. It's the same thing. Let's see. I think that this is my last one. There are three things on the left-hand side here. Romans 1:25. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie. It's not true. It's a lie. Verse 28. They did not see fit to acknowledge God. Verse 18. I don't have this one on the board, but verse 18 should have been in the list here. Ungodliness and righteousness suppress the truth. And so in verse 2 of Romans chapter 12, the alternative. Don't be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable, and teleos, complete, whole, filled up to the top and perfect, like this morning, what we talked about. So, I know it's been a while since we've put our thoughts on concentrating on other things and serving and devoting ourselves towards anything other than God. But I hope the result of this study in idolatry and thinking about everything else, literally everything else under the sun that is not God. It's not a road that ends in a good place. It's not what we want to do. It seems good now, and it seems fun, and I want it, and I crave it, and so I go after it. We're a consumer society, and we get on Amazon, and 2-day delivery is a thing in our world right now. And I got 3 packages out there in the Lord's hands, and the tracking number doesn't work, and I have no idea if they're going to make it by Christmas. And that's not the way that we are, and that's not the way that we think in our world. But that's not a way that's going to end for us in a good way. This is our way. Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercy of God, not the wrath, by the mercy of God, present your body, not to the world, but to God, as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. It's what you do to commit yourself to Him. It's what makes the most sense rationally. Do not be conformed to this world. That doesn't end well. Rather be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing we may discern what is the will of God, not a lie. What is the will of God? What is good and acceptable and perfect? In other words, we're to worship God and to become more like Him. If you're here tonight and I guess what this gospel is that we've been referring to in all of this lesson, that Jesus died on the cross so that we could be forgiven of our sins, not because we are so good and righteous, but through faith in Him who is good and righteous. We have an opportunity to be right with God. That's the gospel that you read about in the book of Romans. If you're ready to leave your devotion and all of your idols in the past, and to devote yourself, to present your body as a living sacrifice to God, and to say, this is what Christianity is. Now I'm yours. That's the true way. That's good and right and acceptable. We'd like to help you with that. Come forward as together we stand and sing the invitation song.